Now, the purpose of using Metasploit is really to identify specific targets, specific services, ports, applications, so that you can then perform a security analysis or maybe exploit that machine. Now, of course, it's important to understand how to identify exploits in the first place. So the nice thing about Metasploit is that we have a command called search, where we're able to identify and find specific things. So first off, let's say I wanted to find anything that was related to MySQL. I would type search MySQL, press enter, and you'll see it gives me, you can see here, number 29 is an auxiliary, and then 28 is an exploit. So we can return the list of exploits, scanners, you name it, that relate to that specific service. Now, if I was to change that, for example, to Microsoft SQL Server, so MS SQL Server, and only want to show exploits, then I can just set the type property to be exploit. And this time around, none of the scanners will show, and all of this will be just exploits. Now, we can go a little bit further by going in and saying, well, actually, what I'd like to do is set the platform for this to be Windows instead. And so then that limits what's returned back to us even further. And lastly, we can also go one step further, because maybe we already know what the CVE is. Now remember, the CVE is the unique identifier that's associated to a known exploit. So let's say it contains 2022. I can press enter and it will say, oh, no, there's no specific results for this one. If I remove some of my other pieces here and just say search for the CVE, then of course I do get a bunch of values come back. So if we kind of know what we're after, we can use that search mechanism. If we don't, then we can expand that to just be a service. And then as you think about it, well, what about when I find a target? How do I identify vulnerabilities and things like that on those machines? Well, one of the first things that's useful about Metasploit is the ability for using a database. So storing of values that we return. Now, previously we looked at using Nmap, and we also touched on using DB Nmap, albeit my database wasn't connected. But now what we could do is do a Nmap scan. So let's say I wanted to do the same scan that we did previously. So we're going to do a scan that's going to say, do a port scan to my entire network of IP addresses. And it comes past and it says, okay, we're now going to execute. We're requesting it to scan as root privileges. It's going to start Nmap. But the beautiful thing here is that the Nmap results are then going to be available to us to import into the database so that we can utilize them and inspect them afterwards. So we'll give this a second to run. This will then scan my environment for my 120 IP addresses and then have a set of information that we can utilize inside the database for later. And the nice thing is we have commands that will allow us to pull out specific things from that information. So you can see here, it's already brought back some information. It's found my SQL Server, it's found a few other bits and pieces, and now it's completed. So it's now scanned 120 services. So let me just clear this. And what we can do is type db_services, and you'll see, okay, this is an old service, a command, because it's prefixed with db, with the new one's actually services, but you'll see it lists me the services that are now available or have been identified as part of the scanning process. So you can see I've got one on the main machine, so VNC, I've got SQL Server, I've got web servers, I've got HTTP available. So after scanning, all of that information is now available to me. Now we can also go a little bit further and narrow this down. We could type in hosts, and that would filter out all of the multiple ports that we've got. And then we can also go a little bit further and we can type vulns, which will then go through and try and identify known vulnerabilities in those target machines that we've identified. We also have the ability to type things like creds, if there was any credentials that it identified, and we can start to pull this information and keep it available with inside the database. Now, of course, that's using the DB_ options for our various scanning capabilities. Now, of course, once we've gone through the process, so let me just go back and type services, for example, you can see that we've got 3389, 5357 ports, etc. If we just clear this and we'll do a 3389 one, I can then do search and type 3389, and this will then come back and show me some of the exploits that are available, or post modules, or whatever it would be that we're trying to utilize for remote desktop. So to identify exploits is really as simple as scanning the sets of devices, making sure we have that information available to us, utilizing tools like port scanning as well on top of it. So we use things like the DB Nmap to do a port scan, store that in a database, then go through and start to pull out the information that's needed. If we find a service, then we can utilize previously the auxiliary scanners that we looked at to be able to inspect them even deeper. And then once we've done that, we can simply use the search command in Metasploit to identify the exploit that we wish to utilize.